Politics and Harmatia. Grace Mugabe is a catalyst of Robert Mugabe's hard downfall. Mpapa Memory 2024. Snapshot. The former First Lady of Zimbabwe, Grace Mugabe, played a significant role in the downfall of her husband, President Robert Mugabe, through her attempts to succeed him and her attacks on his allies, including former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Key findings. The study finds that Grace Mugabe's rise to power and her actions within the ZANU-PF party contributed to the downfall of her husband, Robert Mugabe. The study also highlights the factionalism within the ZANU-PF party, particularly the rivalry between the G40 faction, led by Grace Mugabe, and the Lacoste faction, led by Emmerson Mnangagwa. The key findings of the study include the ways in which Grace Mugabe's actions, including her attacks on former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa and her attempts to succeed her husband, contributed to the downfall of President Robert Mugabe. In the same manner, Robert Mugabe escalated Grace's political powers by allowing her to dominate in Zimbabwe's political grounds. She became more and more influential in the party and government. The nomination of Grace Mugabe was spearheaded by Opa Muchinguri and the youth. Having dominated Zimbabwe's politics for more than 4 decades, Mugabe has been a controversial and divisive figure. He has been praised as a revolutionary hero of the African liberation struggle who helped to free Zimbabwe from British colonialism, imperialism and white minority rule. Grace, who clung to her G40, enlarged the number of enemies she had to fight first before her political ambitions are realized. Objectives. The chapter aims to critically reflect on Grace Mugabe's behavior in conducting party and government matters. The study also aims to examine the impact of Grace Mugabe's rise to power on Zimbabwean politics and the ZANU-PF party. Methods. The study uses a qualitative approach, analyzing the actions and behaviors of key figures, including Grace Mugabe, Robert Mugabe, and other ZANU-PF party members. The study also examines the historical context of Zimbabwean politics, including the country's transition from a colonial state to an independent nation. Grace Mugabe used a variety of methods to achieve her objectives, including attacking her rivals, such as former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, and using her position as First Lady to influence her husband and the government of Zimbabwe. Results. The study finds that Grace Mugabe's rise to power and her actions within the ZANU-PF party contributed to the downfall of her husband, Robert Mugabe. The study also highlights the factionalism within the ZANU-PF party, particularly the rivalry between the G40 faction, led by Grace Mugabe, and the Lacoste faction, led by Emmerson Mnangagwa. The results of Grace Mugabe's actions were the downfall of her husband, President Robert Mugabe, and her own loss of power and influence in Zimbabwe. Conclusions. The study concludes that Grace Mugabe's rise to power and her actions within the ZANU-PF party had a significant impact on Zimbabwean politics, contributing to the downfall of her husband, Robert Mugabe. The study also highlights the importance of understanding the complex dynamics of Zimbabwean politics, including the role of key figures and factions within the ZANU-PF party. The conclusions of the study are that the actions of Grace Mugabe played a significant role in the downfall of her husband, President Robert Mugabe, and that her attempts to succeed him were ultimately unsuccessful. Analysis. Limitations. The study is limited by its focus on a specific period in Zimbabwean history, from 2014 to 2017. The study also relies on secondary sources, including news articles and academic studies, which may have limitations in terms of bias and accuracy. The limitations of the study include the fact that it is based on a specific set of events and circumstances, and that the actions and motivations of the individuals involved may be subject to interpretation. Future work. Future studies could examine the long-term impact of Grace Mugabe's rise to power and her actions within the ZANU-PF party on Zimbabwean politics. Future studies could also explore the role of other key figures and factions within the ZANU-PF party, including the Lacoste faction and the G40 faction. Future work could include a more in-depth analysis of the role of Grace Mugabe in the downfall of her husband, as well as an examination of the broader implications of her actions for the government and people of Zimbabwe. Practical applications. The study has practical implications for understanding the complex dynamics of Zimbabwean politics and the role of key figures and factions within the ZANU-PF party. The study also highlights the importance of promoting democratic values and principles, including the rule of law and the protection of human rights. The practical applications of the study include an understanding of the importance of considering the role of individuals, including spouses and family members, in the exercise of power and influence in government and politics. From Zimbabwe to Sudan, a coup d'état remains a coup d'état no matter how it is managed. Lessons for the African Union Sorom Amos 2024. Snapshot. The African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan has been inconsistent, with the organization treating the two situations differently despite both being examples of unconstitutional changes of government, highlighting the need for the OU to re-examine its approach to dealing with coups. Key findings. The study finds that the African Union has been inconsistent in its response to military coups, with the organization treating the situations in Zimbabwe and Sudan differently. The study also finds that the AU's approach to dealing with coups is guided by the organization's legal and policy provisions, which prohibit unconstitutional changes of government and provide for sanctions to be imposed in response to such events. The study finds that the Zimbabwean military's involvement in removing President Mugabe was unconstitutional, and that the African Union's response to the situation was inadequate. The study also finds that the Sudanese military's removal of President Omar al-Bashir was rejected by the Sudanese Professional Association, and that the African Union's response to the situation was unclear. The key findings of the study are that the AU's failure to adhere to its policy of zero tolerance to coups has weakened its credibility and reduced its potential to deter future coups. The study also finds that the AU's inconsistent approach to dealing with coups has created a culture of impunity, allowing coup leaders to benefit from their actions. The continuous violence perpetrated by the military in Zimbabwe will not end until condemnation, sanctions and suspension is employed by the OU. The window to correct the situation in Sudan remains open. The OU must do the right thing. Objectives. The objective of the study is to examine the African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and to analyze the organization's approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government. The study aims to determine if the OU has followed its own law and policies in responding to the coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan. Methods. The study uses a historical and analytical approach to examine the African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan. The study also examines the legal and policy provisions that guide the AU's approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government. The study uses a qualitative approach, analyzing the African Union's response to the military interventions in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and examining the provisions of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Good Governance. The study also uses case studies of the Zimbabwean and Sudanese experiences to illustrate the African Union's response to unconstitutional changes of government. Results. The study finds that the African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan has been inconsistent, with the organization treating the two situations differently. The study also finds that the AU's approach to dealing with coups is guided by the organization's legal and policy provisions, which prohibit unconstitutional changes of government and provide for sanctions to be imposed in response to such events. The results of the study show that the AU's inconsistent approach to dealing with coups has weakened its credibility and reduced its potential to deter future coups. The study also finds that the AU's failure to take consistent action against coup leaders has created a culture of impunity. Conclusions. The study concludes that the African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan has been inconsistent, and that the organization needs to re-examine its approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government. The study also concludes that the AU's approach to dealing with coups is guided by the organization's legal and policy provisions, which prohibit unconstitutional changes of government and provide for sanctions to be imposed in response to such events. The conclusions of the study are that the OU must adhere to its policy of zero tolerance to coups and take consistent action against coup leaders. The study also concludes that the AU's inconsistent approach to dealing with coups has weakened its credibility and reduced its potential to deter future coups. Analysis. Limitations. The study is limited to an examination of the African Union's response to military coups in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and does not provide a comprehensive analysis of the organization's approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government in all African countries. The study also relies on a historical and analytical approach, which may not provide a complete understanding of the complex issues surrounding military coups in Africa. The study is limited by its focus on the African Union's response to the military interventions in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and does not examine the broader implications of these events for the region. The study also does not provide a comprehensive analysis of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Good Governance, and its provisions related to unconstitutional changes of government. The limitations of the study are that it focuses on a limited number of case studies, and that it does not provide a comprehensive analysis of the AU's response to coups in all member states. The study also does not provide a detailed analysis of the implications of the AU's actions on the stability and security of the continent. Future work. Future studies could provide a more comprehensive analysis of the African Union's approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government in all African countries. Future studies could also examine the effectiveness of the AU's sanctions in preventing or responding to military coups. Future studies could examine the broader implications of the African Union's response to the military interventions in Zimbabwe and Sudan, and analyze the organization's provisions related to unconstitutional changes of government in more detail. Future studies could also examine the role of other regional organizations in addressing unconstitutional changes of government, and compare their approaches to that of the African Union. The future work of the study could involve a comprehensive analysis of the AU's response to coups in all member states, and a detailed examination of the implications of its actions on the stability and security of the continent. The study could also involve an analysis of the role of other regional and international organizations in preventing and responding to coups. Practical applications. The study's findings have practical implications for the African Union's approach to dealing with unconstitutional changes of government. The study's conclusions could inform the development of more effective policies and strategies for preventing or responding to military coups in Africa. The study has practical implications for the African Union's approach to addressing unconstitutional changes of government, and highlights the need for the organization to take a more decisive approach to addressing these events. The study also has implications for the development of regional organizations' provisions related to unconstitutional changes of government, and highlights the need for these organizations to take a more consistent approach to addressing these events. The practical applications of the study are that the AU must adhere to its policy of zero tolerance to coups and take consistent action against coup leaders. The study also highlights the need for the AU to work with other regional and international organizations to prevent and respond to coups. Ambiguities in campaign statements during the 2018 elections in Zimbabwe. An appraisal of Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa's and Nelson Chamisa election campaigns 2024. Snapshot. Nelson Chamisa and Emmerson Mnangagwa, two presidential candidates in Zimbabwe, conducted election campaign rallies, making various promises to the electorate, including improved working conditions, salaries, and infrastructure, in an attempt to win their votes. Key findings. The study found that the candidates used ambiguity as a political strategy to avoid losing supporters and to increase their chances of gaining more votes from undecided voters. The use of rhetoric by candidates was also noted, with a focus on convincing voters of their morally superior values. The key findings of the study are that both Chamisa and Mnangagwa made promises to improve the lives of the Zimbabwean people, including better working conditions, salaries, and infrastructure, but Chamisa's promises were often vague and lacked a clear plan for implementation. The key findings of this text are that Mnangagwa's campaign speeches were marked by ambiguity and exaggerations, and that he attempted to win the votes of different groups by making promises that were tailored to their specific concerns. A critique of the election campaign speeches of the Nelson Chamisa revealed that he exploited rhetoric and ambiguity during his election campaigns. Mnangagwa opted to run with the slogan that his party was bringing real change. He intentionally targeted those pockets of the electorate who previously had faith in the capacity in MDC but became disillusioned when the party failed to beat. Objectives. The article aims to explore the extent to which the statements and promises made by the two candidates clarified their positions and policies. The study also seeks to understand the use of language by political candidates in strategically calculated ways to persuade listeners, readers, or viewers. Methods. The study analyzed the campaign statements and promises made by the two candidates, with a focus on the use of rhetoric and ambiguity. The study also examined the context in which the elections took place, including the military coup that ousted Robert Mugabe from power. The methods used in the study are descriptive and analytical, where the text describes the election campaign rallies of Nelson Chamisa and Emmerson Mnangagwa, and analyzes the promises they made to the Zimbabwean electorate. The methods used by Mnangagwa in his campaign included making promises and pledges to different groups, such as the people of Mutoko and Bulawayo, and using rhetoric to convince the electorate that he was committed to change. Results. The study found that Nelson Chamisa's campaign statements were characterized by the use of Christian rhetoric, with a focus on appealing to the spiritual senses of the electorate. The study also found that Chamisa's party made promises of job creation, infrastructure development, and economic revival, but provided little detail on how these promises would be achieved. The results of the study show that both Chamisa and Mnangagwa made promises to improve the lives of the Zimbabwean people, but Chamisa's promises were often vague and lacked a clear plan for implementation, while Mnangagwa's promises were focused on building a new dispensation and a modernized Zimbabwe. The results of Mnangagwa's campaign were that he was able to create an impression that he was committed to change and that he could reverse the country's economic woes, but the extent to which he was able to convince the electorate is unclear. Conclusions. The study concludes that the use of ambiguity and rhetoric by political candidates can have a significant impact on the outcome of elections. The study also concludes that the electorate's agentive role in determining the future of their nation is often robbed of them due to the use of ambiguity and rhetoric by politicians. The conclusions of the study are that the election campaign rallies of Nelson Chamisa and Emmerson Mnangagwa were focused on winning the votes of the Zimbabwean electorate, but the promises they made were often vague and lacked a clear plan for implementation. The conclusions that can be drawn from this text are that Mnangagwa's campaign was marked by ambiguity and exaggerations, and that he attempted to win the votes of different groups by making promises that were tailored to their specific concerns. Analysis. Limitations. The study is limited to the analysis of the campaign statements and promises made by the two candidates, and does not provide a comprehensive analysis of the entire election process. The study also does not provide a detailed analysis of the impact of the military coup on the election outcome. The limitations of the study are that it only focuses on the election campaign rallies of Nelson Chamisa and Emmerson Mnangagwa, and does not provide a comprehensive analysis of the Zimbabwean economy and governance. The limitations of Mnangagwa's campaign were that he was unable to provide a clear plan for achieving a middle-class economy, and that his promises and pledges were not always consistent with his actions. Future work. Future studies could provide a more comprehensive analysis of the election process, including the impact of the military coup on the outcome. Future studies could also examine the use of rhetoric and ambiguity in other election campaigns, both in Zimbabwe and in other countries. Future work could involve a comprehensive analysis of the Zimbabwean economy and governance, and an evaluation of the implementation of the promises made by Chamisa and Mnangagwa. The future work that needs to be done is to analyze the extent to which Mnangagwa's campaign promises were fulfilled, and to evaluate the impact of his policies on the economy and the people of Zimbabwe. The future work that can be done is to conduct a more comprehensive analysis of the election campaign speeches of Mnangagwa and Chamisa, and to consider other factors that may have influenced the election outcome. Practical applications. The study's findings have practical implications for election campaigns, highlighting the need for candidates to provide clear and detailed information about their policies and promises. The study's findings also highlight the need for voters to be critical of campaign statements and promises, and to seek out detailed information about the candidates' policies. The practical applications of the study are that it provides insights into the election campaign rallies of Nelson Chamisa and Emmerson Mnangagwa, and highlights the importance of clear and implementable promises in winning the votes of the Zimbabwean electorate. The practical applications of this text are that it highlights the importance of clear and consistent communication in political campaigns, and that it underscores the need for politicians to provide a clear plan for achieving their promises. Study subjects. The study focuses on the election campaigns of Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa of ZANU-PF and Nelson Chamisa of Movement for Democratic Change (MDC) during the 2018 elections in Zimbabwe. Graduates. 4. However, the majority of the people who are running the informal sector in Zimbabwe consist of dropouts from as high as Form 4. These Form 4 graduates are working in collaboration with a large pool of college and university graduates who have been churned out of the institutions of high learning but have failed to secure formal employment in the continuously shrinking economy. What therefore should have been highlighted in this campaign was a clear plan on how middle-class economy would be achieved, to convince the electorate and help voters make informed choices on the election day.